Good afternoon to everyone. This is a great pleasure to be a moderator of such a session with distinguished scholars, colleagues and friends. I welcome all of you and particularly our keynote speaker, Professor Marcin Wodziński, and maybe I will start the introduction of the participants with Professor Wodziński. He is a professor of Jewish history and literature at the University of Wrocław in Poland. He is there the head of the Department of Jewish Studies, the Taube Department of Jewish Studies at this university. His research focuses on the history and culture of Eastern European Jews in modern times, particularly on Hasidism and Haskalah. He is the author of many books at this field. The most recent books are dedicated to Hasidism as the Historical Atlas of Hasidism, which was published in Polish and in English, and Professor Wodziński received a lot of prizes and honors for that book. Another very important book is Hasidism Key Questions, and also he is the author of the very important book, co-author of the very important book, Hasidism, A New History. Today, Professor Wodziński is going to speak on Eastern European Jewish Studies, Changes and Challenges. Professor Wodziński, Marcin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michał, for introducing me. Thank you, the conference organizers, for inviting me. I'm happy I'm able to present my thoughts on what I was invited to talk. I'm most grateful. Before you criticize me, my co-panelists, please allow me to thank you now for co-participating in this event. I'm much honored that you agreed to participate in this panel. I'm happy and looking forward to hear what you say. And maybe before I come to the topic of to my presentation itself, I should briefly explain to those who don't understand the structure of 4 keynotes that 3 were supposed to discuss specifically methodological innovations, then what's really to discuss what's new in the Jewish studies and Polish Jewish studies in particular. And because I was put at the very end of this stream, I was asked to talk about what's next, namely to be a fortune teller for Jewish studies. And initially, when I was approached with this invitation, I thought it's not my role as a historian, but then I thought of Yuval Harari, and here we are. Why not historian speaking about future? But seriously, my presentation is to start with what I see as the main framework of where we are now in particularly Polish Jewish studies, but looking a bit broader on East European and global Jewish studies as they are today, and to ask what we should expect in 10 or 20 years from now. So there will be a lot of fortune telling in what I'll be presenting, and I very much hope that we will collectively reflect on whether it's going where I think it is, and whether it's good or bad, and what can we possibly do or do nothing about it. So let me start with several slides that I prepared for this presentation, telling about where we are now, where we start. What I did was very simple count of articles in RAMBI, the index of articles in Jewish studies. I looked for all the articles on the Czech territories, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Russia, and I searched those articles, actually how metadata about them, how they were tagged for thematical categories within each the articles belong. And what you can see here on the screen presents 5 most important, the most visible thematical or disciplinary and thematical categories transpiring in all of them: the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, literature, very generally, religion, and arts. And obviously they are overlapping the values do not sum up to 100, because if we got all of them that are not included here, it would make more than 100 for each of them, because each article could belong to more than one category. There are two regularities in what we see, what you see on screen, to which I would like to point as something that might be indicative of where the field is now. The first one, the most obvious that we see, is the absolute dominance of articles on the Holocaust. It's not only for Poland, where 52% of all the articles attributed to Poland in RANBI are devoted to Holocaust. It is the same with bigger or smaller extent for Romania, Hungary, Czechia. Is the same for Ukraine that I checked for another occasion. So that is one, and this obviously indicates the central position of the Holocaust studies, which I don't think this is the right place to reflect on this and go into deeper debate whether it is the right so and what should be done about it. But it's obviously that it results first of all from transformative power of the Holocaust experience for all global and especially for European societies, and this is reflected so. But it also is an outcome of quite consistent memory, policy commemoration, institutional developments that are happening together with commemoration and the memory of the Holocaust in contemporary world. So this is what we are having, and the questions that might arise together with what I'm presented here. What I'm presented here is about the consequences of this state of affairs. One of them, obviously, is kind of tautological, is that it is impacting the importance of Holocaust to contemporary experiencing of the world, right? This is an element that cannot be overlooked. But I would like to go deeper, asking what is relation between Jewish studies and the Holocaust studies stemming from these proportions, and whether in such a structure of popular interest in scholarship, there is still enough space for cultivating other areas of scholarly endeavor. How much we are informed in our choice of scholarly topics, but by popular expectations. In other words, what is the importance of cognitive stereotypes for academia? And this brings me to the second layer of this chart that I would like you to look at, namely to look on the values below and the differences between, say, Russia and Romania and Poland and Hungary and Bohemia, because here, for Hungary, Poland and Romania, anti-Semitism is the second highest category after the Holocaust. For Russia, this is the top category, followed by literature. The second highest category for Bohemia is literature, followed by arts, but not religion or anti-Semitism. And this seems to me to closely correspond with popular stereotypes of, say, Russia as a country of anti-Semites and great literature, or Bohemia as the secular anti-Semitism-free country of Franz Kafka and modern arts. If this diagnosis, preliminary diagnosis, is correct, it suggests the possible and actually formative influence of popular stereotypes on the structure of academic research on East European Jewish communities. And if it is so, I would like to suggest this might be actually kind of alarming tendency. And besides what I presented with this data, I would like to go to the second group of information, namely to look on, oh no, it's not here, sorry. Here. I apologize. Oh yeah, it is here. This is another group of data that I did. This is all the articles on Jewish studies published in Polish journals, journals dealing with Jewish studies, and all the grants on Jewish topics submitted and accepted by the Polish granting institutions and PLH between the years 2010 and 2020. And there is one very significant tendency, what we can see here, which is the very clear preference for topics dealing with 20th century and most specifically about the Second World War and the post-war period. And distribution here, as you see, is highly disproportional. Antiquity and Middle Ages are hardly visible. Early modern history is a bit better represented in the category of articles, but not research grants, which I think might be an indication of future trends. The most significant trend is huge and growing interest in wartime and post-Holocaust topics. Every second granted article deals with either the Second World War or the post-war period. This is very significant change relative to the state of affairs 20 years ago, when the very concept of the post-Holocaust Jewish history in Europe was very controversial, for some unacceptable. Today's studies of the Holocaust and especially its aftermath dominate the field, at least in a quantitative terms. It seems this reflects a global trend from history to memory studies and culture studies, and increasing focus on the 20th century and the non-historical analysis of contemporary cultures and societies. And again, here I will not discuss these global trends and their consequences, but I think that for historical research and for Jewish studies, this might be in some ways alarming because of the traditional importance of early modern studies and of all the methodological innovations that were brought to the field, mostly by the changes in the postmodern historiography by scholars of early modern, of Middle Ages and early modern history. I'm afraid we might be losing this aspect. This phenomena go together with other limiting, often self-limiting practices of the scholarly activities in Eastern European Jewish studies, which I have no time to discuss, but still I would like to flag some of them, such as a certain glass ceiling for articles dealing on East European Jewish studies for the top-notch journals, periodicals of Jewish studies. Here I counted how many topics are devoted geographically to different areas in last 30 years in Nages Review, Jewish Quarterly Review, and the Jewish Social Studies. And you see that the place of Poland, Russia, Lithuania, not to mention other areas which were not represented at all in this counting, how low this number is. There's also yet another phenomenon that I would like to point to, and I have no time to discuss, namely the politics of citation, which is highly unfavorable to articles in languages other than English, and even more so to articles originating from areas other than American Israeli axis. But now, let me stop at this point where we are now, and I would like to come to my fortune telling, to ask about the future, because the whole point of my presentation is not to complain about the past or contemporary situation, but rather look forward and to see where we are. And for this, I found out very simple tool, namely, if we want to know where the field will be in 10 or 20 years from now, we need to look at doctoral students. Very simple. So their research very often informs their future careers. And what I did was counting all the doctoral students who got accepted at Polin Museum for a monthly doctoral seminar that is arranged there by GEOB, the same institution that is hosting our conference today, which is gathering around 15 to or a bit more doctoral students from all Polish universities writing their dissertations on any aspect of history and culture of Polish Jews. And I divided them by several categories. What is most striking, you can see on this chart, namely that there are no doctoral students writing on medieval. 4 of them, which is 3%, on early modern. The 19th century is faring a bit better with 11%, and interwar still much better, but then the Holocaust and the post-Holocaust period takes more than 60% of all the doctoral dissertations. Very, very significant development, I would say. There is also, if you compare it to research grants and articles that I was showing just before, there's also another interesting shift in what is presented here. Namely, it is much more the post-Holocaust than the Holocaust itself, but this is gradually taking the central place in what interests students, which might be indicative of the tendency. This is not the historical research on the Holocaust itself. It is much more on the Holocaust memory, Holocaust commemoration. This is on topics related to Holocaust in arts, in literature, in other forms of education, public life, and on. Debates around the Holocaust issues, and on and on. So this is what we are seeing now, which is, again, to me, a very clear sign of the declining importance of historical studies for Jewish studies in Poland now and possibly for coming decades. Well, does it mean that we are in decline? I wouldn't say so. It doesn't mean that we are in the golden age either. And the later impression is very often derived from the fact that we have, in quantitative numbers, we have bigger number of articles on anything. But it doesn't mean that they are becoming much more central. They are becoming much more specialized in their subfields, but not taking significant part in a much more general discussion of East European Jewish studies. If I were to say where the field is and should be developing, I would like to point to 4 areas that I see as central. Some of them already well discussed during this conference. Some of them maybe not so strongly, but they were still appearing here and there. And one of them, the first one I would like to point is sorry, I will close the sharing the screen. We don't need it anymore. The first of them is digital humanities. And this reappears again and again in what we've heard so far, I think, and I want to repeat it. What I would like to highlight is that this is not only about access to sources. This is not only about scanning and digitizing materials. It's not just about making those materials available. This is far more about developing new tools of research that will change the way how every historian, whether digital or analog historian, will be coping with historical matter in 10 or 20 years from now. It will be simply impossible to do research without a digital aspect, which doesn't mean that all the research will be digital, but it will be impossible to ignore, to neglect its importance. And whether it's good or not, I'm not going to debate. I believe this is actually fortunate development, because there's also a democratizing aspect in this, on the one condition that we in East European Jewish studies realize the race is here and not elsewhere. And second issue is a turn to material history, something that is actually, there is a prolonged process of developing a focus on the Jewish material heritage in Eastern Europe, but it's until very recently on margins of mainstream historiography. And I very much hope that we are witnessing kind of merge between those two. There is a growing significance of research on synagogues and growing significance of research on the cemeteries. It's not only about documenting cemeteries, but it's about, for example, using this, one of the most important sources for vernacular forms of religion, for everyday religion, for non-normative, non-rabbinical expressions of value systems, of religious imaginations and religious categories in texts that were written by thousands and thousands of people in medieval, early modern and modern period in Eastern Europe. So this is material. Connected to previous is something that is especially dear to me. This is an egalitarian term, which I think is happening. And I think if we fully conceptualize it, we might take full benefit of this, because this is about the changing of perspective on who is the key player in history, and is about who is the agent of what is at stake here. And if we do so, we might better integrate what is still to be better integrated in East European Jewish studies, such as the turn to the missing 52%, as Gershon Bacon called it, namely to feminist studies, to women in place, to gender issues, and gender in relation to men and women. And this is also about post-colonial perspectives that might be allowed by this egalitarian turn, which I very much hope it will happen. Or actually, I believe it is happening, and it will take more pronounced forms. And finally, sorry if I take more time than allowed, but this is my closing point. And finally, the public history. And this is something that I have mixed feelings, but I think it's necessary change. And I think we can profit from the change. The need for public history stems from the fact that we historians in the 21st century are finding ourselves on stranger tides. I think that we are confronted with expectations, with pressures that we are not certain how to cope with. And this is about in Poland, it's especially important with parametric obsession that we have today, the way how scholarship is evaluated and how it is funded. But there's also pressure of many other media's possible participation in public history events, and what is the place of historian there in museums. Polin Museum is one beautiful example, but other Jewish historical museums in other places. Moscow Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center is another great example. We have refurbished the Jewish Museum in Berlin. We have many other museums and other institutions that work in similar way. We have other forms of starting from online platforms, which is again taking us to digital, video games, films, any tours, whatever, right? You name it. A lot of forms at which historians are engaged and very often perceived as distraction from our main historical vocation, which I believe it is not, because it's also providing a shift in perspective on what historians do. Namely, it is with public history, we have good chance to become more digital oriented and much more egalitarian and take care and take better understanding of material turn. So actually it very nicely wraps up all the other issues, because public history is very often local history. And this is very often about local heritage, about local cemeteries, about local synagogues, about what was happening on everyday level of life. So it's again turning to egalitarian vernacular forms of religious life. And I think that if all this happens in our field, there is still a hope for our craft. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wodziński, for your very interesting presentation. Before I will give a voice to the commentators, I need to do something what I should do at the beginning to introduce myself. So my name is Michał Galas, and I'm a faculty of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the Jagiellonian University. Now we are going to the second part of our session, the commentary, and as commentators, they are invited 4 distinguished scholars from Israel and United States and Poland. And I will ask them for their responses, for their comments in alphabetical order. So the first will be Professor Natalia Aleksiun. Professor Natalia Aleksiun is a professor of modern Jewish history at the Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Touro College, New York. She is currently a senior fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Polish Studies in Warsaw. Beginning of the January next year, 2022, she will be a Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies at University of Florida. She is the author of many books. For example, the book on the Zionist movement in Poland in 1944-1950. She also co-edited 2 volumes of Polin on Holocaust memory and on Jewish historiography. She is also editor of a special issues of the Autobiographia and European Holocaust Studies, and she also prepared a critical edition of the book, The Destruction of Żółkiew Jews by Gershom Tafet. Her most recent book is a book published by the Littman Library in this year, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust. She is also a co-editor-in-chief of the East European Jewish Affairs. So, Natalia, the floor is yours, and we are waiting for your response.
Thank you very much, Michał, for this kind introduction. Thank you and congratulations to the organizers for a fantastic, rich, and truly inspiring conference. I don't know how you pull it off. So many fantastic panels that we've been listening to and participating in. And thank you, Marcin, for your provocative comments. Now, from Michał's introduction, it's clear that I am speaking here slightly as an offender, i.e. part of those trends that you charted for us. And so I will be on a defense line, even simply from the point of academic autobiography. But let me raise a few points and a few questions. So you give us in this provocative nuanced lecture, you give us a map of Poland and Eastern Central Europe in terms of their current, past a little bit, and possible future status for the field of Jewish studies. And the questions that this lecture raises really touches on what we've been touching on or hearing about in the previous keynote lectures as well, namely, but you do it really with tour de force on the lens of unique national context. What I find in your lecture particularly interesting is that this is also a particular regional characteristic that you're touching on, not only Polish, unique Polish story, and how it ties to academic cultures, to different academic cultures and different scholarly infrastructures. Now, I'm here as a person who is very much in between, raised both in the Polish and American academia and briefly adopted by the Israeli one. And so I hope to further a little bit this conversation and raise a few additional questions, but also to push back ever so slightly on your concern that the Holocaust may dominate the field, may become a sort of a black hole for Eastern European Jewish studies, and in some ways break the historiographic chain of progress or methodological innovation that you mentioned. I'm in fact equally concerned not only about the future of the field as such, but also about the future of the field of Holocaust study, especially as being taught and researched as part of Jewish studies and Eastern European Jewish studies, which is not at all a given. So I want to touch on the prospect, touch on why I think that Holocaust studies may in fact be good for the field of Eastern European and Polish Jewish studies, and raise a few additional thoughts on the future. First, on the question of the uniqueness of Polish situation and the possible effect of this quote-unquote overrepresentation of Holocaust studies. In my view, what we see in Holocaust studies, and it is particularly important, I think, when we talk about Eastern Europe, is the call for integration, what Saul Friedlander called integrated history of the Holocaust, how this integrated history of the Holocaust has been slowly has been practiced with regard to Eastern Europe, and the kind of methodological innovation and new perspectives that it brings for the field in general. Among many other aspects, it raises important issues with the very basic terms, such as Jews and Poles. And here the discussion that hasn't ended, but I think is extremely fruitful, again, for the field, the calls that Joanna Tokarska-Bakir made for the use of the term of non-Jewish Poles and Jewish Poles rather than Poles and Jews, scholars that question the very term of Polish-Jewish relations. And this is not limited now in scholarship to scholarship on the Holocaust, and not even on this studies of the aftermath, and I'll come back to it, but even increasingly informs and shapes and provokes new perspectives on contemporary Polish, Eastern European Jewish studies about the 20th century, especially the interwar period comes to mind, and this idea of writing integrated humanities. So art historian Renata Piątkowska comes to mind, studies on the academic milieu that are not related directly to the study of the Holocaust, two excellent doctoral dissertations that will be defended very soon at Warsaw University by Iza Mrzygłód and Natalia Judzińska. I see a direct intellectual connection between these new studies and the impulse that comes from Holocaust studies. And then they are, I believe, pushing us forward, not only, again, necessarily in modern Jewish history, contemporary Jewish history. And I would even risk a suggestion that this intellectual methodological innovation that is so connected to the work of Moshe Rossman, of Jakub Goldberg, of Adam Teller that is sitting here with us, that this is to some extent, I don't know, now very much present in the context of contemporary history and Holocaust history. This playing with the notion of limits of integration, not as a political integration, but as intersectionality of Poles and Jews, Polish Jews, non-Jewish Poles, Jewish Poles, all these terms that are much more probed by historians. Then the second aspect I want to raise in defense of Holocaust studies is the question of how this field is being practiced and how, again, it pushes new and interesting work that in the end does not necessarily remain limited to the Holocaust, which is the work that pushes the chronological boundaries. I think that Francois in the opening lecture said something about having no patience for discussions of anti-Semitism that start in the 19th century. And in a way, a lot of Holocaust scholarship doesn't start in 1939. This breaking of the barrier of 39 as some kind of magical divide, which again doesn't implicate necessarily that this is not a decisive change for Polish or Eastern European Jewry, but it's intellectually and methodologically stimulating. So again, just to think of Javi Dreyfus's work on Matysovce, on the Hasidic network in a Warsaw Ghetto, that informs us about religious practices and continued social networks in a Warsaw Ghetto, but also says a lot about pre-1939 Hasidic youth and builds on it. And then the work that specifically challenges the 39 as a divide, again, one ongoing project by Jan Olaszek on Roman Zimand, of course, work of Sam Castle comes to mind, Marcy Shore and others. So this would be my 2 points in defense. Now, my point of concern that touches on the Holocaust as a field as much as on the field in general, which is that, and I will say something very obvious, which is that the field of Holocaust studies is particularly vulnerable to any kinds of efforts at sanitizing. And so we can see it very clearly in Poland. And in this respect, that institutions and infrastructure that Marcin mentions in his paper might just as well be a source of problems for the field. And beside Poland, we saw it, for example, in Kiev, in Ukraine with regard to Babi Yar, the research institute, the museum, it's an ongoing question. All that seems to be so much pushing the field to be tilted towards the Holocaust, I don't think it necessarily works this way. And then the question of aftermath studies, I agree that Holocaust studies is going through a great change. I have the pleasure of co-chairing the Holocaust division of AJS, and I see it over the last few years with applications that are being sent to us as Holocaust papers. And sometimes it's not really clear to me how these are necessarily Holocaust studies proposals. But again, I think that it might be seen in a Polish case, especially as a source of intellectual stimulation. Just one example, forthcoming book of Ewa Koźmińska-Frejlak on post-war modes of domesticating Poland by survivors that very much raises questions that still await scholars of their own of intermarriage, sort of longer patterns of intermarriage before the Holocaust. Now, my few questions, I don't want to run out of time that we will all share for discussion. So you raise very interesting issue of cognitive stereotype and how this may condition scholars to write certain things. And indeed, the Czech case is fascinating. What I'm curious about is, what do you think about public and academic discussions that do not happen? And here in the Czech case, what comes to mind is a very important work by Michal Frenkel on anti-Semitism in Czech lens that precisely very much poked at this notion of a land without anti-Semitism, but did not lead to a big public discussion as far as I know. So do those discussions bring more scholarship? What's the relationship between the two? Could you speak a little bit about your intuitions on the Russian case? This is the one that surprised me the most, given the dominance in the public discourse of the Great Patriotic War. I find the low score of Holocaust fascinating. Now, one specific question to some of the data that you discussed in a written paper more, which are the successful application for grants. I wonder, how does this picture change if we were to look at grants that were not granted money? Is this the same map? And how does the expectation of what can give you a successful application, what kind of a topic will be seen with favorable eyes? How does this affect the funding, not only the funding of proposal, but writing of the proposals themselves? I fully agree with the great opportunities offered by digital, though I am yet to learn. I fully agree with material culture, and I look at it in a particularly warm way because of how much it continues from the pre-war calls for precisely that kind of work. And I would like to add two additional prospects. One you alluded to, speaking about local, but I would make it in a way into a broader category, which is microhistory, micro-historical studies, and the other one is family history, and that familial term that was discussed in one of the excellent panels yesterday. And then I will twist egalitarian quality and turn it as an egalitarian minion, meaning what seems to me has changed very much in the field of Jewish studies, Eastern European Jewish studies, Polish Jewish studies, is the presence of women. And I remember AJS conferences 20-something years ago. And I think that this is, to some extent, I don't know if we can quantify it, that this is what, to some extent, brought all these egalitarian topics. And it's enough to go to sessions about women, child rearing, education, family history, etc. It's usually presented by female scholars. And the field as such, I think, is increasingly manned, as it were, by women. So I wonder what you think about this aspect in terms of the future. And then the last question.
Natalia, excuse me, but maybe you will keep this last question for the discussion because we have limits of the time.
I can keep that, but this is a sentence. Eastern European Polish students training abroad, scholars from abroad coming to Poland to train.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Natalia. And Marcin, you will have a very tough work to keep all these questions, proposals in mind, because we have really important people, and all of them, they will have such difficult questions to you. So thank you, Natalia. So Shaul Stampfer will be the next commentator. And Shaul Stampfer, he grew up in United States, then he went to Israel, he studied at the Hebrew University, he became a professor of Hebrew University, now he is emeritus professor of the Hebrew University. But Shaul also was very active in Russia. He taught at the Institute of Jewish Studies in Moscow, and he helped to establish a city Jewish university. He is the author of many very important studies. Among others, he is the author of the book Lithuanian Yeshivas in the 19th Century, Creating a Tradition of Learning, and the Families, Rabbis, and Education, Traditional Jewish Society in the 19th Century Eastern Europe. Both were published in Hebrew and in English by Lithuanian University, and also in Russian, but Lithuanian Library, and also these books appeared in Russian. Now he is interested in conversions of Khazars to Judaism, and also the history and meaning of falafel and bagels as a Jewish food. And I remember your lecture in Krakow on this subject, when we have still obwarzhanek, which is also this type of food. And he is currently working on the settlement of Jews in the 16th century Poland and on genetics of Eastern European Jewry. So welcome, Shaul, and we are waiting for your response.
Thank you very much. First off, I should respond to the presentation. Since you mentioned my work on the Khazars, I just want to say one sentence. It never happened and they never converted. But it took me a long time to prove that. With regard to Marcin's talk, I want to mention in part some comments on the data. and then to go on to the consequences of what Marcin found. Marcin based his analysis on Rambi. Thinking about that, I realized that certain articles were missed because Rambi doesn't always pick up publications in Poland that don't deal with Jewish topics. So regional journals or specialist journals sometimes have articles on Jewish topics that never reach Rambi, and this is a problem. However, I try to follow the literature. The big picture that Marcin presented, as far as I know, is absolutely correct. And since it is my habit to suggest projects for other people, it would be very interesting to study the breakdown of publications in Ukraine, because there I think there's a different phenomena. I think I'm one of the few people who tries to follow what comes out in Ukrainian, and it's a very different dynamic there. And it would be interesting to see, first off, on objective, quantitative basis, if it really is different, and if so, where. But I think there are some differences in Ukraine. The problem is it's very hard to get a comprehensive picture because there's no systematic bibliography that I have found of ongoing publications. Now, to the consequences. I'm not so focused on intellectual history, so I have a different question, and that is, what are the economic realities of Jewish studies in Poland? Or to be precise, where is there money and where can someone today get a job? Now, in Israel, I have spent some time talking to prospective students of Jewish history and telling them they really should think about getting a job in computers and to read Jewish history in their spare time. Because in Israel, at the moment, there are almost no university level positions open in Jewish studies, in Jewish history, for certainly. And there are exceptional students today. The students today are much better than the students were when I was at the university. There's no question about it. But in my generation, many of us got jobs. I got a job by accident, but other people got jobs by merit. Today, it's hopeless. I don't know what to tell students today who finished a great thesis and simply say there are no positions open. So I think that the job market has a big impact on how people see the future and how they pick topics. Now, if a person is looking today to see where there is money and funding, there is a lot of money available in Holocaust research, and there should be, and it's good. In Poland especially, there are also ancillary jobs with tourism, groups, research projects. So I think it's quite normal for students who think that in the future they're going to have to pay rent for an apartment, they've got to feed themselves, they may want to set up a family in one structure or another. How are they going to do this? So that I think that if there is a breakdown, as Marcin shows, it might well reflect the perceptions of how it is possible to earn a living based on the studies. In addition, to go into Jewish topics in earlier periods, it requires a lot of study of languages because one language is not enough. One needs several languages, which is difficult. Whereas, just as in Israel, topics that people think they can do only in Hebrew are very, very popular. The worst situation is Hebrew and English. But to master a different languages, what's the point? Pick a topic that does not require additional languages. And I think the same happens in other countries as well. So I think that if there's an interest in changing the balance of topics, the question really should be answered by funding. And it's necessary to consider ways of guaranteeing positions in the future in various areas, and to see how this can be sponsored and supported. If somebody today, for example, finishes a doctorate on Hasidic thought in Łódź, Wrocław, or Krakow, or Warszawa, or other places as well, where are they going to get a job? How many students are they going to have? America has an interesting situation because there's general undergraduate studies are not specialized. So you can teach students about Hasidism, and then they will go on to study law or business administration. In Europe and in Israel, where the focus begins earlier, then you teach students about Hasidism if they want to study about Hasidism. How many people are going to study? So I think that it would be useful to consider frameworks such as an Academy of Sciences, which could provide employment opportunities based more on research than on teaching and university activities, and see if this might have some impact. The problem is finding the funding for this, and this, I think, is best discussed not on a public platform such as this one here. So I leave the intellectual discussions to the intellectuals. For me, the main concern is how are our students going to support themselves after they finish their course of study. That's it.
Yes, thank you very much, Shaul. Thank you so much for your strict questions and very important questions. We are going to another perspective. I would like to ask Professor Adam Teller for his comments. And Adam Teller also studied at the Hebrew University, and we had a chance to meet several times there. Now he works as a professor of Judaic Studies and History at the Brown University. He has written widely on the economic, social, and cultural history of the Jews in early modern Poland, Lithuania. His first book was dedicated to the history of Jewish quarter in Poznan during the 17th century, and it was published in Hebrew in Magnus Press in 2003. His second book on money, power, and influence in 18th century Lithuania, the Jews on the Radziwiłł estates, was published in Hebrew in 2005, and also in English in Stanford University Press in 2016. And his most recent book is about Great Jewish Refugee Crisis in the 17th century, and it was published last year by Princeton University Press, and was also the finalist of the National Jewish Book Award in History. So welcome, Adam, and please about your comments.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Michal, for that very generous introduction and for reminding me of our meetings over the years, which have always been incredibly enjoyable, stimulating. First of all, I should like to thank the Polin Museum for the History of Polish Jews, and particularly the conference organizers, for inviting me to participate in this fascinating and very stimulating panel. Next, I should like to thank Professor Marcin Wodzinski, for his extremely penetrating and enlightening analysis of the state of the field and what he sees as possible future directions for research in Jewish studies in general and Polish Jewish studies in particular. And I'm sure he'll be glad to know that I found what he said interesting and important and have very little critique. So it's on the question of possible future directions for research, what the conference title calls paradigm shifts, that I should like to focus my contribution to today's discussion. The significance of a paradigm shift as far as these comments are concerned is that it has the power to transform a whole range of different aspects of the one field in which it occurs. So my starting point is Professor Wodzinski's identification, I think it's in his written paper more than his overall presentation, of spatial analysis as one of, and I quote, the research practices and methodological theories that might refresh studies of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. What I should like to do here is to pursue his insight and to exemplify the processes of change he discusses by examining in a little more detail just one shift in that direction that already seems to have begun in Jewish studies. I will discuss its influence so far and try to consider the enormous possibilities it will open up for the future for Polish Jewish history in particular and Ashkenazic and Jewish history in general. In that way, I hope to expand the discussion that Marcin has started with his important presentation. So the shift I'm interested in is that away from history writing, whose horizons are determined by the political borders of any given country, to a trans-regional approach. In fact, for a while now, work on the 19th century has seen a move from what is termed a national to an imperial approach to Jewish history writing. However, the paradigm shift I should like to discuss is considerably broader than that. It focuses on the trans-regional factor in Jewish history, that is, the complex web of connections that existed between distant Jewish centers. And it sees in their effects, that is, the effects of the connections, a new way of understanding the course of Jewish social, economic, cultural, and religious development over time. Now, this is an absolutely crucial issue, since it goes to the very heart of the Jewish experience of the diasporic people. Almost wherever Jews have settled during the long history of the Jewish diaspora, they have never been entirely geographically cut off from other Jewish centers existing at the time. The connections could be more or less intense, but they were always there. Jewish history is fundamentally, therefore, a connected history. More than that, the transregional connections in which we are interested always provided pathways for the movement of people, money, commodities, and ideas between Jewish centers, and as such played key roles in the development of Jewish society and culture over huge distances. Nonetheless, in today's historical research, the so-called cultural turn still seems to dominate. It holds that, in the words of David Beale, in his introduction to the influential collection, The Cultures of the Jews, and I quote, "The culture of a minority group, such as the Jews, can never be separated from that of the majority culture surrounding it." Though this idea has been critiqued, most prominently perhaps by Moshe Rossman in his book, How Jewish is Jewish History, it remains a dominant paradigm. And as a result, the whole transregional dimension of the Jewish experience often seems to have fallen off the research agenda altogether. The nature of the connections between Jewish centers, what passed between them, and how this might have influenced the development of each are all questions that remain difficult, sometimes impossible to answer. Such has not always been the case. In previous generations, the so-called Jerusalem School of Jewish Historical Research, with its focus on the centrality of the land of Israel, saw the connections between Jewish centers as a wholly natural expression of the Jews' eternal and unchanging national spirit. To grasp the power of that insight, one need look no further than Gershom Schollem's masterpiece, Shabtai Tzvi, which demonstrates how that mid-17th century Messianic movement brought Jewish centers across the world into a purposeful religious relationship with one another. For the field of Ashkenazic studies, Jacob Katz's classic early modern study from the same academic milieu, tradition and crisis, is of fundamental importance. However, though it acknowledges the trans-regional nature of Ashkenazic Jewish life in the 16th to 18th centuries, it assumes the existence of a single Ashkenazic cultural realm characterized by a Jewishly nationally based homogeneity. As a result, it sees the connections between the different centers as being really of little cultural importance. Scholarship since Katz has demonstrated that the idea of cultural homogeneity in pre-modern Ashkenazic Europe is unfounded, leading to a series of rich regionally based studies, and most of what I've written throughout my career till today. As a result, however, the significance of the trans-regional connections has often been ignored. In more recent years, what might be termed the maritime or the oceanic turn has led to a re-evaluation of the importance of trans-regional connections in historical research in general. In fact, it was Sanjay Subramanian's work on the Indian Ocean environment that underlay his very important concept of connected history, which is the basis of my comments today. His approach has certainly had an influence on Jewish historical research in some of its aspects. The study of the Jewish Mediterranean is a flourishing field, as is the study of the Jewish economic networks that crisscrossed the Atlantic basin, particularly in the early modern period. In studies such as Jonathan Israel's Diasporas Within Diaspora and Francesca Trivellato's The Familiarity of Strangers even bridge those two settings. However, important as this research is, it has its boundaries. First, it remains predominantly focused on the Sephardic experience. Second, Jewish transregional connections were by no means limited to the oceans and seas, even if they encompassed them. And third, it was not only through travel and cross-cultural trade that Jews in different regions remained in contact with each other. If we are to encourage the new perspectives that a trans-regional paradigm shift in the study of Eastern European Jewish history might bring, the first thing to be done is to map out the nature and extent of Ashkenazi Jewish networks, first across Europe, from east to west, and then across the globe. As the studies of the Sephardic context have shown, it is economic networks that are of fundamental importance here. And I'm pleased to say that studies of the Ashkenazic world have begun to take up the challenge. So, for example, Cornelia Orst's important book, The Jewish Economic Elite, Adam Mendelssohn's book, The Rag Trade, and Sarah Abrevaya-Stein's Plumes have in fact opened up the field of Ashkenazi economic network for the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century respectively. However, 3 books is by no means enough, and there remains a huge amount of work to be done in order to reveal in all their detail the complex web of economic connections that joined the different Ashkenazic Jewish centers. No less important is to trace the ways in which cultural influences traveled transregionally and how they affected the development of Ashkenazic Jewish culture and religion in its different centers. Clearly, the history of the book and later the mass media are of central importance here, as Elchanan Reiner has shown in a series of articles on 16th century Jewish publishing, and Hagit Cohen did her Hebrew study of Yiddish publishing and reading in the United States from 1890 to 1940. However, very little systematic study has been devoted to the transregional nature and significance of Ashkenazi Jewish publishing in any period. Books and newspapers are, of course, crucial agents in the transmission of ideas and ideologies over great distance, right? And as this is clearly shown in Jonathan Frankel's classic study of radical Jewish politics in Eastern and Western Europe and the United States, Prophecy and Politics. Of course, the circulation of people is just as important as the circulation of books. And a key phenomenon in this aspect of the Ashkenazic historical experience is the creation of an Ashkenazic transregional rabbinate in the 18th century. Remarkably, despite the huge amount of ink spilled in studies on individual rabbis and the rabbinate in various settings, little work has been done on rabbinic networks and the effects of rabbinic circulation on the development of Ashkenazi society and culture. The possibilities of such an approach have, however, been suggested by Joseph Davis in his paper, The Reception of the Shulchan Aruch and the Formation of Ashkenazic Jewish Identity. In it, he demonstrates that it was, among other things, the mobility of rabbis trained in Poland, which allowed the Shulchan Aruch, with Moshe Isserles' Polonocentric glosses, to influence the development of Ashkenazic society, culture, and religion across Europe. Similar research for later periods remains to be done. And this, by the way, as in fact all of these issues of networking, are fantastic examples of fields in which the methodologies of digital humanities discussed by Marcin in his paper and by many others during this conference will play an absolutely major role. Letter writing is also a key and understudied form of transregional contact and exchange of ideas between different centers. Though some work has been done on the so-called Briefsteller, the exemplars from which letters could be copied, the culture of letter writing as a transregional contact remains to be studied. One example of the benefit of such research, that such research might bring may be found in a network of Ashkenazic rabbis, and often with a modern education in the mid-19th century. Some were directly influenced by the Wissenschaft des Judentums project, while others were more engaged in antiquarian history, but they all regularly corresponded with each other, exchanging materials and ideas. This epistolary network seems to have stretched at the very least from London in the west to Odessa in the east. And Miriam Tulin's German language study of the Budapest-based scholar David Kaufmann and what she terms his intelligence service has opened up this field, which she identifies as crucial for understanding the development of modern Jewish studies. In similar vein, the study of Hasidism, perhaps the most important international religious movement in modern Jewish history, would benefit from a more transregional approach. There are many regional studies on Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and even American Hasidism, some of which do refer to the great distances between the Rebbe and his court and the individual Hasids in their hometowns. Once again, Marcin Wojcinski has begun to explore these Hasidic networks, also taking the first and extremely difficult step of mapping out at least some of them in his award-winning Historical Atlas of Hasidism. Still, the effects of distance and the mediation of those networks in, for example, the transmission and shaping of Hasidic ideas, culture, and material culture remain to be explored. The one field of Ashkenazic transregional history that has been studied in depth is migration, in particular mass migration. The movement of Jews from Eastern Europe at the turn of the 20th century, particularly to the United States, the creation of immigrant societies in their new homes, and the cultural transformations which occurred there have all been studied in detail. A newly developing focus of such research is mass migration in the immediate post-Holocaust period, from the DP camps to the survivors' new homes in the United States and Israel. And more broadly, Robert Chazen's recent book, Refugees or Migrants, Pre-Modern Jewish Population Movement, is an attempt to give an historical overview of this phenomenon for the earlier period. The related and final topic is forced migration or refugee studies. This, as I discovered when working on my own book, Rescue the Surviving Souls, the Great Jewish Refugee Crisis of the 17th Century, which deals with the waves of refugees created in the wake of the Khmelnytsky uprising and the subsequent wars in Poland and Lithuania, is a very rich field. In addition to the history of travel and the cultural consequences of the intimate meeting of Jews from different centers, it also opens up new perspectives on the phenomenon of transregional Jewish philanthropy as another form of contact between otherwise distant Jews. As should be clear by now, the paradigm shift involved in a move into Jewish transregional history has the power to transform research into a whole range of topics: Jewish cultural history, the history of Jewish migration, the history of the Jewish religion and Jewish thought, rabbinic history, the development of Jewish identity, Jewish economic history, the history of the Jewish book, Jewish philanthropy, the development of modern Jewish studies, and the study of Hasidism, to name but a few. Just as important, it moves us away from a locally bounded approach to our research and opens up new perspectives and horizons. Work of this sort has certainly begun, and research projects such as the one entitled Transregional Contacts and Connections in the early modern Ashkenazic world, run jointly by the Charles University in Prague and Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, which has, by the way, organized one of today's sessions at this conference, right? They hold out much promise for the development of this field in the future. I shall end with Moshe Rossman's incisive characterization of our host, the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. In one of his papers, he describes the museum as categorically Jewish, distinctly Polish. And indeed, the Polin permanent exhibit is perhaps the jewel in the crown of a generation or more of research into Polish Jewish history in its Polish context. Perhaps the time has now come to refocus our gaze on studying Polish Jewish history in its trans-regional Jewish context too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your very important opinions and observations. And next, our commentator is Professor Marzena Zawanowska. She received a PhD in Oriental Studies from Warsaw University in cooperation with Tel Aviv University in 2008. Now she is assistant professor at the Anielewicz Center for the Study and Teaching of History and Culture of Jews in Poland at the Faculty of History of Warsaw University. And she also works as a curator of manuscripts in Emanuel Ringenblum Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. She is the author of many books and studies on Karaites, Bible exegesis, and also on the history on the Jewish literature. And she has a lot of many projects on this field. She didn't mention in her bio that was sent to me that she is also a very important person in European Association for Jewish Studies, that she is in the board of this organization. So Marzena, please share with us your comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this kind presentation. And also I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in this fascinating panel, and to Marcin for sharing with us your very inspiring paper. As a proverbial Polania, I will open with some apologetic remarks. First of all, I will address only a few of many important points raised by Marcin. And secondly, what I will say is not a result of an in-depth qualitative or quantitative research, but rather my impressionistic appraisal of a situation based on personal experience. And thirdly, I must say I was confused by the title and more specifically by the term Polish Jewish Studies. I guess it may mean both. It may mean studies and research conducted in Poland on any Jewish topic, but it can also mean research related to Jewish history and culture in Poland conducted anywhere in the world. So for the purpose of this presentation, I arbitrarily decided to focus on Polish Jewish studies conducted in Poland, yes, and related to any subject. So my general observation first is about self-imposed marginalization. Professor Wodziński opens his talk with very optimistic appraisal of the state of Jewish studies in Poland, and then he debates whether it is indeed so or not. And I would like to nuance this golden age appraisal with this one main point, which relates to self-imposed marginalization. That means with the tendency of Polish scholars of Jewish studies to publish not only in Polish language, but also in Polish journals. I know that there are some scholarly disciplines which require or invite publishing in the Polish language and publishing locally to the benefit of target readers, but it's not definitely not the case of Jewish studies, like Jews themselves, as well as the history and culture that developed in many different countries of the diaspora. So too are Jewish studies, distinctively a cosmopolitan international nature. So I see no reason of publishing in the Polish language research in Jewish studies, and it's not because of a lack of good journals of international standing. And this phenomenon is over more surprising and troubling as it sometimes marginalizes research of very good or even brilliant quality. Professor Wodziński talks about qualitative flourishing. So we are hiding this qualitative flourishing in Polish journals, which are not available elsewhere. So I think this is the first weak spot of Jewish studies in Poland. Second observation, it refers to the centrality of the Holocaust studies. And maybe I will be very provocative, but I'm not even sure if Holocaust if all Holocaust studies should be considered part of Jewish studies and not studies of genocide and violence, of which Jews as likely can just likely be victims as the representatives of any other nation. However, if we assume that Holocaust studies are an integral part of Jewish studies, they are indeed dominating. But I would like to add one more field that Professor Wodziński did not mention, that is the history of Jews in antiquity and history of biblical literature. This is another field which is maybe not flourishing, but developing well in Poland, mainly in Christian academic context, but still it is somehow it's still Jewish history in antiquity, so it's part of Jewish studies. And then we have this 2,000-year gap between these two periods, which is almost not existent in Poland. And I fully agree on that with Professor Wodziński. Now we could also ask ourselves why Holocaust studies are so dominating in Polish research in Jewish studies. And I think there are several explanations. First of all, I think it is Polish, it concerns education or education system in Poland. Jewish history is largely absent in Polish schools apart from the Holocaust, which for better or worse means that the Holocaust is very often the point of entry into Jewish history for many Polish scholars. So I think this is one reason. Another one, I think, is psychological. I think that Jewish studies in Poland are never emotionally neutral. It's not like physics or mathematics. And in this sense, they utterly differ from all other scholarly disciplines. 1,000 years of our rich common Polish-Jewish history and its most tragic end looms over the present day. And on the one hand, we have still people who hold grudges against Jews as an irrational heritage of the past when Christian and Jewish citizens of Poland were neighbors. On the other hand, if I may use a paraphrase, the voice of our murdered Jewish brothers' blood is crying unto us from the Polish ground. So it's really difficult to be emotionally neutral. And we also observe this among students, that many of the students are either anti-Semites or philo-Semites. I would say the anti-Semites are the minority, but they are too. So, and they are emotionally driven. And they are seeking a personal relevance, and that is why sometimes they choose, or very often that is why they choose Holocaust studies, because it's related to their family history, to their local history, to the history of a town, of their towns, etc. Now, the characteristic feature of such emotionally motivated people who enter the academic world is that they are They usually come with some preconceived concepts and opinions. And what is interesting, they are unprepared to change them very often. So they come with certain attitudes and they are not willing to change, which is, I think, a failure, in some sense, a failure of Jewish studies in Polish academia, that we don't manage to reshape opinions. And I also, in this sense, I agree with Professor Wojciński's diagnosis, which suggests that the possible and formative influence of popular stereotypes on the structure of academic research of Eastern European Jewish communities. It's a function of our students and then researchers and their point of departure. Now, third observation, it relates to the general commercialization of scholarly studies and of universities. It is true that now every big university in Poland has Jewish studies in its offer, and then having them, it's important for political or historical reasons. And nevertheless, it is becoming more and more difficult for these programs to attract students. And we may wonder why it is so. In my view, it is due to a large extent to the growing economic approach to the teaching learning process and the general commercialization of studies. We see that only in the last decades in Poland, but I guess it was already well known in Western Europe much earlier. On the one hand, we have students who are coming with this economic awareness, and they, I think, are much often are asking themselves that we did, what they will do at the end of the studies, how they will earn their lives, what possible profit they may gain in the future thanks to the skills and diploma that they acquire during academic studies. And of course, this tendency, it's not profitable to humanities. So as a consequence, we have fantastic classes offered to a few students. Now, on the other hand, we have universities which have started to think of studies as a product to be sold to general public. As the money the university gets.
Marzena, Mike, we don't hear you.
I'm sorry, I must have, sorry. So I just said that the demand begins to dictate the supply. Universities are developing those disciplines which are potentially more interesting for students and thus more rentable for universities. These disciplines are not often new disciplines or new disciplines of studies are not opened because of their inherent value, but because they are fashionable and they may bring more money to the university. If I may add my comment of my own, I think we are sometimes really cheating the students because we are selling them products which we are promising them a great future if they finish a given discipline or curriculum of studies, but I'm not sure if it's true. Now, a corollary to this process is the disappearance or contraction of those disciplines that are not profitable enough. And of course, such an approach also favors, and I quote from Professor Wojciński, the extensive political interference of state authorities executed under the rubric of historical policy, because there are significant incentives to following a state agenda that may bring money to the university as a whole or to the individual researcher. Another side effect of this process is that we are really, and again, I go back to Professor Wojciński's observation, we endanger the generational chain of scholarly transition, indicating a drastic loss of specific linguistic and technical skills cultivated through generations, because we are now not trying to develop this old, well-established disciplines of studies, but we are rather opening new direction of studies. And this generation and transmission may be lost. And this brings me to the fourth observation, which relates already to the future of Polish Jewish studies. Professor Wodziński proposes 4 postulates for more digital, material, egalitarian approaches, as well as for stronger inclusion of public history. As noted by Professor Wodziński, the scholarly study of the material culture and heritage of Polish Jews is already now developing in Poland and may indeed be a profitable venue for further research in the future. And I think the same optimistic appraisal applies to public history, whose additional benefit is that it really may provide an effective antidote to the venom of historical policies, also mentioned by Professor Wodziński. But the 2 other observational postulates I would like to discuss more in detail because I'm not sure if I agree with them. First, the digital approach. I think we should bear in mind that new technologies in humanities are only helpful tools and not a goal in or of themselves. I can see a potential danger in that they give an impression that they could replace knowledge and human expertise, while sometimes there is no valuable content behind the facade of something very modern. And at the end of the day, these digital tools can accumulate and process large amounts of big data. That's true, but they are unable, at least so far, to raise interesting and important research questions and to draw valuable conclusions from the digested materials. So this is my first, I'm sorry, I'm missing an English word, my first hesitation in regards to this point. And the second one concerns this the new age in research in terms of breaking with the traditional obsession of textual erudition mentioned by Professor Wodziński, who says that it is the most significant change happening in the field of historical research of Eastern European Jews. And of course, I agree that it is a very positive change that the field has opened to new avenues of research and that it is now possible to conduct research on subjects going beyond the wealthy, the learned, and the mighty. But there is a negative side effect of this new, more egalitarian approach. Namely, it may sometimes be used as an excuse to justify ignorance. In other words, sometimes the equality it offers, it is the equality in ignorance. I hope I'm not too provocative. But generally, research and study develop, at least to some extent, in function of the nature of materials available. The erudite obsession of many Jewish authors, whose texts are the subject of scholarly inquiry, requires erudition from the scholars who study them in terms of languages and classical texts, etc. Therefore, in certain aspects, this new trend of rebellion against elitist erudite approaches may prove problematic. It is impossible to be a good physician and ignore Newton's laws of thermodynamics or to be a successful mathematician without the knowledge of algebra. The same rule applies to Jewish studies, in my view, given that the objects of scholarly inquiry are founded and grew from an erudite tradition, a more than rudimentary knowledge of this tradition is necessary for anyone wishing to conduct research in the area of Jewish studies. Even those dealing with modern topics, I may mention, I don't know, Yehuda Amichai or modern authors, to study of whom we need a thorough knowledge of tradition. Erudition simply forms an integral part of a tradition of Jewish Am HaSefer or Ahl al-Kitab, if you wish. In Poland, the tradition of the scholarly study of Jewish history and culture of such outstanding erudite scholars like Samuel Poznański has been broken.
Marzena, I would like to...
I'm finishing.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, just 2 minutes. As a result, since Second World War, we have dramatically lacked scholars with expertise in these areas, with a thorough knowledge of diverse Jewish languages and source texts. This lack of continuity is another weak spot of Jewish studies in Poland, in my view. As opposed to the countries that suffered less from the Holocaust and post-war anti-Semitism, in the case of Poland, a more egalitarian perspective in Jewish studies is not a matter of choice, as we have no longer any alternative in the form of tradition of elitist erudition to choose or reject. I would even venture to propose that it might be that it is another reason why scholars so eagerly engage in studying modern Jewish studies, and especially the Holocaust, as it does not require a thorough knowledge of sources in Biblical, Mishnaic, or in Rabbinic Hebrew, as well as Aramaic and Arabic, all these languages being of utmost importance in studying many other aspects of Jewish history and culture. I wish we had a continuous elitist erudite tradition to rebel against, but we do not. So in our specific situation, we should rather seek to restore it to the extent of our limited possibilities, at the very least as an inspiring, enriching, and stimulating alternative for other new perspectives and approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marzena, for your comments. We have only half an hour for discussion and the answers of Marcin. So I propose 10 minutes for Marcin to try to answer the questions and give the opinions. And then I will read the questions that I received on chat to all speakers, not only to Marcin, but to all speakers. And I have to tell you that all of you received thanks from the audience for your presentations. So Marcin, I know this is a tough work, but if you could in 10 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try to do it even faster, because there was a wave of great questions and suggestions and comments actually to all of us, and not to me particularly. So I would like you, Michał, to direct those questions to whom you think should start responding to them, because it will help us to go faster through at least some of them which I think have to be addressed here. Thank you for your great comments and suggestions, and I agree with a great majority of them. At the same time, let me respond as they came, starting with Natalia, about those new studies inspired by the Holocaust. And here I obviously see the interaction, and I should start with explaining one more time that I'm not criticizing either research on the 20th century or on the Holocaust. I'm only saying that the very good fact of such a great and rapid development of those areas should not lead to the situation when other areas are totally neglected, abandoned in a sense, right? We have great Middle Ages professors who have no students to train within the field. And that's what I'm saying. This is a danger of the breaking the chain of transmission, this human to human transmission of very specific skills that you cannot write into the book, that you cannot learn from internet, that you need to study with your teacher, right? And this is what I'm saying. And as for the innovative aspects of the Holocaust studies, I'm quite aware that it is so, and I quite follow what are methodological innovations coming from the Holocaust studies, and I believe that it's a lot of interesting things happening, and they transfer to other areas than the Holocaust studies. And indeed, to name just a few, like forensic archaeology, which is so important, started with the Holocaust studies and moving beyond this area, like environmental history, so important for the Holocaust studies, but moving outside, and all this post-anthropocentric turn inspired by Eva Domańska. But actually, I believe that this last example might be interesting for us to consider, because it shows that those methodological innovations in the Holocaust studies, they don't happen necessarily by the Holocaust researchers. That they come, that namely people who are at the, are focusing on the history of historiography, on the methodology of history, when they probe new tools they suggest, they tend to choose the Holocaust rather than other areas. Why? Because they expect widest resonance from this. So this is kind of vicious circle of, doing within the Holocaust because this is the best response, and then because of the response, then you do it here. So I have no definitive answer to this, but obviously I'm not questioning the Holocaust studies bring innovation and they inspire other studies. And what you say about breaking the barriers is obviously so, happening from both sides. It is for many years, decades already, that people in Jewish studies outside of the Holocaust studies were banging on others not to look on history of the Holocaust as history without Jews, and not to start the story with 1933 or 39 or 41, whatever you choose, right? But rather to see it as part of, if we want to speak about Jewish history, the Holocaust as part of Jewish history, to look on this aspect, to look it into broader perspective. Debates that don't happen, and actually, I believe what's happening now in the Czech debate is indicative that you can finally you can get debate, and this is the example not of Michał Frankl, but what is happening with a book co-edited by Katerina Czapkova and Hillel Kival, Prague and Beyond, because finally the voice was so pronounced they could not ignore it, and there is very significant response inspired by nationalistic positions that are voicing all the controversies about this excellent book and very important book. So this is my response. Yeah, it is possible to ignore it until a certain extent. When it's getting too pronounced, too visible, it makes the change. So it is not, we are not doomed yet on this ground. When you ask about grants that were not granted, obviously there's no such information. It's confidential. Nobody allows it to go out. So there's no way to look into this. But I understand that your question also links to what Cecile Kuznits asked about possibly sensitive issues. And the question would be very legitimate to ask, what is changing after 2015, after new regime comes to power? Is there a pressure of populist, nationalistic perspectives on avoiding certain topics? And I believe there's none. I see no change in articles. Well, this is an outcome of longer process of study, but also in grants submitted, in topics of the grants submitted. I still believe that Polish academic life, to a significant extent, is still defending itself from submitting to political expectations from the regime. So well, we are all aware of this, and we see individual concessions, but as in the quantitative numbers, you don't see the visible outcome of this. And I think this is another optimistic observation that I have based on this quantitative material I gathered. To the question about the sources that was asked on the chat, Shaul already responded. This is not my selection of journals, it's all of RAMBI. And of course, RAMBI is not covering all of publications, but it is true for all. It's Bohemian, Polish, Ukrainian, and others. So actually, the distortion of the picture is the same for all others, and it might distort it in some way, but still they are comparative and they are indicative of what it is. They are not fully accurate. They are indicative of the tendencies. And that's enough for us to understand where it's going, I believe. Microhistory, family history, I couldn't agree more, of course. This is methodology applied to those more egalitarian perspectives applied here. The question about Polish training, Polish students trained abroad and scholars from abroad coming to Poland, it's too broad to respond now. As you know, as all of us know here, there is huge effort on breaking this barrier, and in some way it is happening. Maybe too slowly and to a limited extent, but it is happening. This is also a factor of discrepancies in wealth of societies, how much we can afford, how much a Polish student going abroad can afford living there simply with the fellowship he gets or she gets, they get, right? So this is another issue which I will not cover now. For comparing Ukraine, Shaul, I did. When speaking for the Ukrainian Association of Jewish Studies this summer, there was a conference in Kiev. It was on, it was in Lviv. It was on Zoom and I did the same comparison, and the outcome from RAMBI is very similar to what we have for Romania or Hungary. Not as strong as for Poland with the dominance of the Holocaust, but still quite significant. It might be not fully representative, as you are saying, because the secondary literature in other languages is not as widely covered. Economical realities. Well, I couldn't agree more, obviously, but at the same time, I don't think that the picture that you are suggesting to is precise in a sense that it might be true for Israel, there are no jobs. when I look on the situation from the Polish perspective, 10 years ago, I couldn't agree more with you, or 5 years ago, I couldn't agree more with you. But today, I'm in a situation that I cannot find a candidate for a doctoral fellowship, and I cannot find a candidate for a postdoc, meaning they're not people with dissertations who would fulfill kind of minimal requirements for certain, maybe not long-term positions, but postdocs, fellowships within research projects and on. So actually, we are maybe reaching a balance, and this balance is short on both sides, unfortunately. So, well, I don't know where it goes. I don't think that academies, as you suggest, a resolution is the way. I doubt, because for this we would need to have extensive state subsidies and long-term thinking, kind of strategical ideas developed by the Polish or other East and Central European political elites. And I seriously doubt we will have such political elites in the near future. What we can hope on is extensive fundraising, foundations, donors, and on, to substitute for what those academies will not do. I doubt it. Adam, thank you very much for your comment on the transregional aspect, and I fully agree. And I think some of those issues that you pointed to are represented at this conference, actually. So they're showing this is indeed happening, and it's not only with Paweł Sladek and Milan Rzońca and their research. It's the same with when you say about rabbis in the 19th century exchanges. Alicja Maśniak-Maciejewska showing the networks of rabbis traveling between different territories and bringing those liberal ideas between, right? So we have this research going about books. There is interesting research on prenumeranten. I believe that will make the outcomes available. So I think this is the way to go, obviously. And your book about rescuing the surviving souls is obviously the excellent illustration of the potential, the great potential of this transregional approach. But to be again a bit provocative, I would say, looking from my perspective of Hasidic studies and understanding what the Hasidic studies are responding to, I would ask when transregional is becoming a-regional. These free-floating Jews, the ideas that travel freely across boundaries, right? So transregional does not mean that we ignore boundaries. It's actually a reintegration of geography in a higher sense than it has been so before. So I would say this is kind of Hegelian way of thinking, that we move from ignoring into including into something that goes beyond by seeing that we can go further. But essentially, I agree on this. Marzena, thank you for your comments and for your corrections to what I was saying. In some way, to those that don't know, it should be also added that your corrections come from an area that is flourishing in Poland in qualitative terms, the CARATE studies. But if you look on this in quantitative categories, it's hardly visible. And that's one of my wonders why it is so. Even bigger areas like Yiddish studies also fare quite badly when you look on the number of publications, right? So that's why I'm suggesting that we should look on this. When you talk about difficulties of attracting students, I think this is, and somebody was pointing to this fact on the net. This is universal. This is for humanities in general. This is not only for Jewish studies, and this is not only because of their economical concerns about future of the, as Shaul was pointing to also, but I think it's something more general, something that was already diagnosed about the younger generation, about this is a safe generation. They avoid the risk. What was at my generation or your generation or at any of our generations, choosing academic career was not a safe choice. It was not because there were many positions. None of us had big chances of getting position, but we were ready to take the risk, right? And today we have a generation that is not ready to take the risk. And that's the essential difference as I see it now. It's not only about the number of positions, which is another factor that contributes to this. True, positions moving away from the humanities to STEM and actually disappearing, replaced with adjunct teaching and all those changing that we know about. So this is the issue that I think we need to take into consideration is just different expectations, that many young people are not ready to take the risk of maybe yes, maybe not education. You spend 10 years and you don't know whether you will get position finally or not. Maybe also the relative advantage of getting it is smaller than it would be in the past. So that's why it's not worth taking this risk. But I would also suggest considering this generational issue of young people who were brought up with a telephone in their pocket, always controlled, and very rarely taking really risky behaviors. The age, not interesting new angles, as you say, I couldn't disagree more. There is a lot. What you are talking is about, which is about very traditional perspective on digital humanities as source provider. And it's only one of three roles of digital humanities. Another being online publishing, which is also kind of traditional. And the third one, most exciting, is about providing new tools, and those new tools providing new research questions and new areas that we were not aware of before. And one of such area is GIS, Geographical Information Systems. GIS allows for processing such a big amount of information that we were 20 or 10 years ago, when I had the list of 130,000 people on map, I was unable to see the broader map. Today, I have it online in my database, and I can, with one click essentially, I can produce a map that shows me the big picture, it shows me the mezzo picture, and it breaks it into details. And this is actually, the database is the source. It's not that I need to process it myself in my brain, and then only at the very end to produce the map. Maps today are the source. So I'm coming to the end of my time.
Marcin, may I interrupt you, because we have a list of the questions, and at least right. I would like to read some of them, and maybe you and other participants of this panel could answer. Maybe I will group the questions. The questions, there are several questions regarding Holocaust in Jewish studies, and based on why the Holocaust is the most popular in this area. So the questions are: what is the definition of Jewish studies? The question and from Harvey Dreyfus, she wrote that also in Israel, the most of the research dedicated to Holocaust is not about the Holocaust itself, the historical studies, but on the memory and commemoration. Could this be a wider phenomenon? So this is also about, I think, about Poland. About why the Holocaust studies are important in Poland in this political situation. Can the political situation in Poland and in Israel influence on the changes on the topics? And Scott Uri is asking, why should the students not go to the medieval period, why they are dealing with the Holocaust? Antoni Poloński is asking, would the different presentations like to comment about the different purposes of Polish Jewish and Jewish studies in the three major centers, Israel, Poland, and North America, and how this might impact the state of the field and its direction? I think this question is for the next panel or the even next conference. But this is the questions regarding the state of Jewish studies and state of Jewish studies, about the synthesis of this field very, very often. I hope that the participants will receive the questions, because some of them are very important. Natalia, how do you define Jewish studies? The works you mentioned in your presentations are a very broad spectrum of the topic. Can we treat them as a Jewish part of the Jewish studies? From Dariusz Stola to Shaul, I think the question on jobs applies to the humanities in general, not just Jewish history or Jewish studies. Should we encourage students to study it despite the scarcity of jobs, in hope this will change before they complete their thesis? To Shaul, thank you, Shaul, for your presentations. To Adam from Professor Bartal, would you comment on the trans-regional nature of national or Zionist historiography? Could someone comment the gap between academic history and what is current in the broader society, whether Jewish or non-Jewish? Would someone like to comment on the role of the Instytut Pamięci Narodowej in Polish scholarship? Yeah, it was not mentioning here. Yeah, to Marzena, thank you from Barbara Kirschenbrat. Gimblet. Marzena, thank you for raising the issue whether Holocaust is a part of Jewish studies or not. So I was mentioning. And another question from Professor Poloński. Did any of the panelists follow the recent discussion in Kwartalnik Historyczny on the present state of Polish historiography? How relevant is to our discussion today? I'm sorry, I will stop reading the questions, and now we have a couple of minutes for the commentators. If you could give the answer or comments to the questions from the audience. Shaul, maybe you can start.
I don't have any comments. I think that I'll donate my time to some of the other participants who have more to say. Okay.
Adam, I leave Natalia later because the most of the questions are to you. So to give you more time. Adam?
Okay, two things, and I'll try and be very brief. Professor Bartal asked about national and Zionist historiography. Indeed, because of the nature of national thought and the national conception of what the Jewish nation was, it was very important in that historiography to construct the connections that bound the nation together. What I find less helpful in that is the inability to see how those connections change both sides of that both sides of the equation. It's not just that they're connected in my understanding, but it's that connection changes the development or affects the development of both sides. And that is very difficult. I don't see that really emphasized clearly in the nationalist historiography. I also want to respond to Marcin's point, which is absolutely right about being a-geographic, right? So you have this sort of history floating around, and Hasidism can go that way. I think that Yiddish studies too, this idea of Yiddish land is the same thing. And you're absolutely right. What we need to make this work is indeed studies that are contextualized in a certain place, but are taking into account the relationship of that place with distant places. So you're right, I absolutely agree. And in Yiddish studies, we do have studies that are not just about Yiddish land, but about Yiddish in, I don't know, Yiddish in Israel or Yiddish. I mentioned Hagit Cohen's book about the Yiddish publishing in America. So that's the way to go, and that's the way to create the kind of paradigm shift I was talking about. Finally, in the question of employment and the question of public history, it seems to me that what we've taken for granted is that historians, or research historians, should also be public historians. I don't think that's right. I think most of us struggle. I mean, some of us are very good at it, but most of us struggle. And maybe the training that we need for this generation, right, where the research jobs are limited, is to start training public historians, training people whose expertise is in presenting history to wider audiences. And that might solve both the question of historians influencing society and also the lack of employment. So that's kind of meta-historical teaching, training for meta-historical posts or meta-research posts. That's it.
Thank you so much. Marzena, do you have any short comments?
Yeah, I will eagerly give my time to Natalia as we have 5 more minutes and I have no specific question to myself. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. So, Natalia, you have 3 minutes.
I feel it's sort of proving the point that Marcin was making. And yes, I may just say to Adam that I agree absolutely with what you said and what Marcin wrote and spoke about. And it has to do also, I think, with how we write, something that I'm struggling with. And I think that how we write has to do also with what gets to be discussed beyond 5 colleagues and maybe a spouse who will read what we have just published and are very proud of. Now, these are fantastic questions that were raised, but let me just take it to the question that Marzena raised and Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett raised, because it really kind of stuck a dagger into my professional heart. I would argue that, of course, it's a question of how we see Holocaust studies, and just like Jewish studies, it's a very big pot containing extremely diverse ingredients, both in terms of disciplines and chronology and approaches and fields, etc. But this is exactly what has been a concern since and during the Holocaust, that it does not become a perpetrator-focused history. And frankly, for me as a social historian, I don't even know how this would be done if people or community that I look at or a milieu that I look at somehow on September 1st or September 25th of 1939, they somehow leave Jewish history and maybe or maybe not return to it with the liberation or with the return from the Soviet Union. So I think that the concern really stems more from a sense that Holocaust studies sucks oxygen out of the room in which we're all sitting together. But I think it also practically offers some possibility. And I agree with you, Shaul, that there is an ethical question, and there is an ethical question for sure. But on the undergraduate level, and I think that this is something that is certainly a feature in the US. I don't know about Israel. I would be very curious to hear from Javi and Scott and others. In the US, this is what brings students to the classroom. These are the big classes. But I believe that if this Holocaust class is taught the right way, people might return for more that is not about persecution and destruction. So it's about the approach, the perspective, and seeing Holocaust studies as part of Jewish history that kind of makes it into part of Jewish history. So please stay with us, Holocaust historians.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And the last voice to our keynote speaker, Professor Wodziński.
Thank you. There is a lot of questions and issues I wanted to respond, but have no time for this. So my last question is, if you are not too tired, I would love to talk to whoever wants to continue on this coffee table, coffee shop, whatever. They don't serve coffee there, I assume, but I'll be there. And if you want to continue discussion, I'll be happy to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So if the organizers are looking for another topic, for the topic of another conference, so we gave you the proposals, because what was discussed today by Professor Wodziński and the commentators of his keynote lecture is a really fascinating topic for the conference, not for such short sessions. So I'm very sorry for the audience that I couldn't read all the questions and that you couldn't hear the answers. But these are the limits of the conference. So it was a great honor for me to moderate this panel, and thank you all the participants of this conference, and I hope soon we can see each other live in Jerusalem, Krakow, Warsaw, or any place for a normal conference. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the audience. Goodbye.